Thanks. So I'm honored to be facilitating the conversation today between three amazing people who are doing really important work in response to the education crisis. We have just under an hour for what I'm sure will be an interesting and fruitful conversation, during which I'd really like to include inputs and comments from the diverse perspectives and experiences that we have from everybody on the call. So please do get engaged. So I'm really honored to present Nic Spaull, Merle Mansfield, and Hope Chidawanyika to our panel. Nic has been doing a huge amount of work pretty much his whole career as an economist on the education crisis through his work at RECEP, and he's also the co-founder of Fundawande. So he's not only an academic in the space, but also a practitioner. Fundawande aims to ensure that all learners in South Africa can read for meaning and calculate with confidence by the age of 10. Merle spearheads DG Murray Trust's Zero Dropout campaign, which brings together researchers, policymakers, implementers, schools, learners, and caregivers with the aim of halving the rate of school dropout by 2030. And Hope is the CEO of Become the Youth, which is an after-school program that enables young people to pull themselves and each other out of poverty through education. So I'm going to ask each of the panelists to share some opening thoughts in response to the investment case paper and the issues that it highlights, and I look forward to taking the conversation from there. I'll hand over to Nic to kick us off.
Great, thanks, Joy. So Joy said we've each got 5 minutes to share, and I promise I'll stick to that. And Joy, feel free to interrupt me and stop me if I go over that. So I think everyone is familiar with the report. We've got the link, and I thought I would just share on 2 issues. One is on education expenditure, and the other one is on learning losses. So the first one is that on education expenditure, we released a report last year that was looking at the budget, and what we showed was that the cost per learner, if we're looking at that in big picture terms, has been roughly around 20,000 Rand per learner per year, if we take into account all of the costs related to education. But that a lot of this is captured by teacher salaries, and teacher salaries have increased significantly over the last 10 years, which is the gap between those top 2 lines in the graph here. And if we look at how that's changed by provinces, it hasn't affected all provinces the same. And I think this is some of the work that Joy is going to speak about in a moment, where calculating the cost per bachelor pass or cost per maths at pass at 65% requires these sorts of calculations to be done so that we can say, in terms of the investment case for after school, how much should we be investing in the sector? We also know that in quintile 5 schools, this is from a paper by Shireen Mutala and David Carroll, that there's a huge top up to quintile 5 children because of the fees that are charged in the schools that they attend. And I think that the after school space, particularly as it pertains to quintiles 1 to 4, is aiming to help add on additional services to kids that are not getting those services at their schools. But what do we know both about learning losses? And I also want to make a suggestion about saying, in the after school space, there's still a choice about where we intervene. Do we intervene in high school? Do we intervene in primary schools? So in terms of learning losses, this is slightly, I don't know why that's happened. But the gist of that one, which I can explain, is that we've seen 50 to 75% learning losses as a result of COVID-19, where children in 2020 learned between 50 to 75% less than children in 2019. Now, the question of where we should be intervening, I think many of us will be familiar with this, both practically on the ground as well as through research. The blue line here is showing you the trajectory that the average no-fee child is on, and the red line, the average child in a quintile 5 school. And we can see that by the time children are in grade 9, they are heavily off track. They are no longer on a trajectory that they are going to be able to pass the matric exam. even though they are physically in grade 9, chances are that in terms of learning outcomes, they can do much less than that. The recent TIMSS report showed, and I've just pulled out 2 example questions from the grade 5 report here. You can see if we look at the number of kids that can do a simple calculation like 700 minus 28, this is less than 30%. 1 in 4 children can do the calculation 700 minus 28 in grade 5. Only 38% of kids can answer 5 times 25. So I think what this is showing us is that the wheels are already coming off quite severely in primary schools. And if we're asking where we should be intervening, my case the provocation that I'd like to put to the panel and to the audience is that we really should be focusing on the primary school level rather than the high school level. And then just in the last minute, this is some new work that I'm working on now, which is just to say, when we think of government policies, we can think of 3 different things. We can think policies can be announced, but they can have no funding. For example, the focus on reading. The president and the minister talk a lot about reading, but there isn't a lot of money that's actually allocated to reading. In many instances, they can be announced and funded, but have no plan. For example, the fees must fall movement. And sometimes they are planned and funded, but never announced. These are clandestine policies. And I think what the question that I want to pose to the panel and the audience here is that when we're thinking of the after-school space and the investment case for the after-school space, we shouldn't overly celebrate announcements that the after-school space is really important. We actually need to focus on funding. When we look at the Treasury documents and the budget speeches in February that get announced and the medium-term budget statement towards the end of the year, if we see money that gets allocated to the after-school space, then we really know that we are making progress. Whereas if we only see plans and announcements, we really shouldn't celebrate that too much. Basically, we need to see what are the revealed preferences of government rather than the stated preferences of government. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Nic. Merle, over to you.
Thanks so much, Joy. Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Nic, for that presentation. I don't have a presentation this morning, but I'm going to share some of just the striking things that came through from the Learning Trust report and how it relates to the work that we're doing at Zero Dropout Campaign. I think one of the first things that I want to position is just that I think there's this huge opportunity that exists within the education sector in terms of the access we have to every child in South Africa. I think that a large majority of children are in the school space, particularly in their formative years, primary school. There's a huge opportunity to have an impact on the trajectory of people's lives, on children's lives when they're exiting that school space. And so I think that for me was something that energized me when I thought about all of these challenges that we are sitting with and talking through today. The second thing is that repetition in our schools are particularly rife, and particularly in our low and no fee schools. So we found in our report that we had commissioned from RECEP in 2020 last year, we looked at the data from the Lurid system between 2018 and 2019. And we found that repetition in quintile 1 to 3 schools was particularly high, and that about 39% of children in quintile 1 to 3 schools were at the right age for their grade, meaning that 60% of kids were not, and so had already repeated at least once within that space. We also found that repetition for boys was higher than for girls. And that it is especially high in grades 1, 4, 10, and 11. And so we can see that there are particular spaces which is also impacted by the progression policy, where kids are held back a little bit more. But why is this important? It's important because when a learner is over age for their grade or repeating, it is a proxy indicator for dropout in many cases, and that global findings have shown us that where learners are repeating more than once, they are a lot more likely to drop out of the school space. Secondly, why is this important? It's because our schools who are low fee or no fee schools often don't have the resources to do the kind of work required when a learner is repeating a grade to help them catch up, to support them, to remediate the concepts that they haven't fully grounded in yet. And so again, a real opportunity for a mechanism like the after-school programs to come in and crowd in that support into low fee and no fee schools, particularly, to be able to support learners to access that remediation space, first of all, and also perhaps help to remediate the skills. The other thing that I definitely noted from the report, and that was also useful for us to think about today, I think, is just the impact of COVID. Again, our low fee and no fee schools have had a greater impact because of COVID, already dealing with challenges such as overcrowded classrooms, under-resourced spaces, and lower or lesser human resources to be able to implement the necessary things we need for social distancing, for example, and the rotational learning that needs to take place for learners to attend school now that schools are open. And so again, the impact on these learners are a lot greater. Also, the access to devices and the access to teachers because of distance learning, and trying to incorporate that for our learners in these spaces are very poor and less likely to happen. And so we know from our research that school dropout is actually is preceded by a long process of disengagement that happens before the learner eventually drops out of school. And all of these issues and factors that a learner needs to navigate impacts their disengagement. And over a period of time, that disengagement gets heightened and the learner eventually drops out, particularly where the support is not crowded in to prevent that from happening. And so we can see how learners within these spaces have a harder time trying to navigate their way through school. And so policies and mechanisms to support them are very important. The last thing, Joy, before I go off, I just want to add on to what Nic was saying in terms of funding. A very striking fact that came out from a report that we had done in 2019, which looked at the cost of repetition to the fiscus. It was calculated that the cost of repetition is about 20 billion Rand a year. And so we can see the impact of, just not planning and not investing in the right kind of aspects to get learners through the system and the cost of what that is to our country. Second to that, I think, knowing that when a learner drops out of school, that they are less likely to access post-school opportunities, less likely to access jobs, less likely to be able to be economically active in a meaningful and gainful way. There's also the loss to, their own earning potential for the rest of their lives. And so very important discussion this morning. Thank you to the Learning Trust for opening the door for us to think about how we're investing and doing that more appropriately.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Merle. Hope, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Joy, and good morning, everyone, and a warm welcome to my panelists. I think very interesting insights coming from Nic and Merle, and unfortunately, Joy has put me in an unenviable position of trying to demonstrate what the after-school program can actually achieve, and hopefully we'll be able to do justice around that conversation. And looking forward to sentiments that will come from the panel and everyone on the call. I think just to start off, Joy, I don't have a formal presentation, but I'm just going to give you some high levels coming out of the report and contextualizing it to the after-school space. I think let me start off by thanking you, Joy, and the panel, and the great work that has been done by TLT to get us here. I think it was about time that the spotlight is definitely put on the sector and its impact. This research is critical in showing how little it costs to get outcomes with bachelor passes and matric passes, and how important it is to make this investment, not only for the learners themselves, but for the country as a whole. We cannot continue to see such a poor number of learners succeeding, particularly when our country needs scientists and mathematicians. I'm not going to take too long and won't go into the report itself. I really wanted to highlight a few things about the after-school sector and costings to help frame the conversation this morning. As already articulated by Merle, COVID has had massive implications for learners and their backlogs. They need help more now than ever before. And after school was a solution prior to COVID, and it's even more relevant now. We have to meet the learners where they are in terms of direct support. Just a brief background around Ikamva Youth, for those that don't know us. Ikamva Youth has an 18-year history of delivering impact. Our program spans grade 8 to 12, and despite the challenges of last year, over 544 learners through our branches wrote matric. 88% passed and 51% achieved a bachelor pass. We are contributing to building a sector of after-school programs by providing support to other organizations, providing academic support to learners. We're currently supporting 20 or so organizations through our community collaboration program, which also works in partnership with the Learning Trust. There is collective impact there too, where another 300 learners completed grade 12 at 87% passed with passed matric, with 51% with a bachelor pass also in the 2020 academic year. Key to our program success is not just the school results, but the focus on the future. We make sure that our grade 12 learners apply to at least 3 opportunities and ensure that they are placed at the end of grade 12. On average, we place 45% in tertiary and another 40% in other types of opportunities, supplementing matric, learnerships, and internships and stuff like that. And our alumni surveys show that 80% access tertiary education, jobs, learnerships, and those who are making, and ultimately, these guys are making a meaningful contribution, of course, to the economy. Nic touched briefly on the issue of cost per learner. And in terms of our program, just to give an example, of course, these numbers vary from program to program in terms of how it's implemented. Our cost per learner is quite low considering the amount of hours of support learners get. Our average cost, taking into account all our programs and indirect costs, is currently on average about 7,500 per annum. Whilst we are happy with our success, we know that the numbers we are working with are small in comparison to the scale of the problem. This year, we are supporting over 5,000 learners through our various programs with 800 or so in matric. The question on everyone's lips is, can we scale up to meet the demand? I believe the sector is poised for scale, and Ikamva Youth, the Learning Trust, and other players in the sector can have a significant impact in supporting the sector with training, mentoring to deliver high quality after school programs for quintiles 1 to 3. And just one other thing, which both Nic and Merle touched on, related to growth and the kind of impact that after school programs can have, is the growth aspect. And definitely in our experience, we've realized that we need long-term partnerships to get better outcomes to ensure that the sector is sustainable. After-school programs and of course, we're including ourselves there, we're saying we can support corporates to get a higher BE score with SED and skills development spend. And the important thing here is that multi-year funding gives stability and the ability to plan for the long term and scale rather than situations where organizations get one-year grants. That just makes it untenable in terms of the impact and scale that the sector can achieve. And just to demonstrate that the sector has the ability to actually scale with the right kind of support, Ikamva Youth at the moment is about to sign a very big deal with a South African corporate, which will see us reaching an additional 2,200 learners this year in rural areas in the STEM field. And I think, as Nic alluded to earlier, the issue around revealed preferences and stated preferences, I think, is absolutely critical because we are not yet at a point from an investment perspective walking the talk. The investment in this sector is still very little, and I hope that this research and this discussion will put the spotlight a lot more around sustainable funding for the sector. That's it for me, Joy, for now. Look forward to engaging on the report. And thanks again to yourself and Joy. We appreciate your work. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hope, and congratulations on this great big leap for scaling Econ Youth reach and impact into more regions. It's very exciting. So there's so much about what all of you have spoken about that I'd love to dive into. I think just zooming out, and I mean, each of you touched on the learning losses, and thanks, Nic, to your colleagues with the NIDS-CRAM research that looked into that and really showed us the huge impact that school closures have had. I think, yeah, I'd just like to hear from you, from everyone on the panel, and what are your thoughts in terms of the ripple effects of those learning losses? What are we going to see if we don't do something now? And I guess tied to the learning losses, the other thing that NIDS-CRAM has highlighted is the issues around hunger and unemployment. So if we look at the ecosystem in which children are learning and growing and developing, how is the last year and the ripple effects of what's happened, what is that going to influence? I mean, a lot of, you know, when we look at the reports, those infographics, all those numbers are pre-COVID, you know, frightening things to look at, but that was before these learning losses. So I'd like to just understand from each of you on what you see the potential effects could be.
I'm happy to start. I think on the first one, something that's maybe not currently given a lot of emphasis, and Merle can maybe weigh in on this on dropout, is we are seeing in the interventions that we have, for example, in the Eastern Cape, that when we went back to try and test kids in 2021 at the start of this year, these are the same kids that we assessed in 2019, but weren't able to assess in 2020. We couldn't find 15% of them. And this is in the foundation phase. So this is and we don't normally think of dropout, there's always some degree of school movement, but in the report, the evaluation report that we're going to release on Monday on our website, I think that's something that's underemphasized, is that all of these school closures is going to lead to increased repetition and dropout. And apart from the nutrition effects, which you've already mentioned, Joy, I think the mental health effects on children are also severe. And the long-term effects are likely to be on flattening learning profiles. So assessments of kids coming into grade R and grade 1 are showing that their preparedness for school is just much lower than in previous cohorts. And I think that these are not things that you can remediate. I think even the DBE is now saying we need to stop using the word catch-up, basically because it's not going to happen. And that we need to think of, you know, the remediation strategies that are being implemented in the UK and the US are orders of magnitude greater than what we are contemplating here, you know, getting every single child an after-school tutor to catch them up. Whereas we're just going back to regular schooling and we're not even going back to regular schooling yet because we're still on rotational timetables. So I think the idea that something is in the past, in other words, this has happened in 2020 and we now need to fix it, it is ongoing. The hemorrhaging and the learning losses are ongoing because kids are only attending school every second day rather than every day. So we are very much in the midst of it.
I guess I'll hop in next, Joy. I think just tagged onto that, Nic, one of the things that we're seeing is definitely kids are not returning to school. Now, so schools being open, learner attendance being very poor. So our implementing partners in Western Cape, KZN and Eastern Cape have all reported struggling to get learners who were in their cohorts in the previous year and access to them. Learners attending school as well, even though it's rotational timetabling, so missing their days that they're supposed to be at school and then missing a week because of that, in some cases where schools are rotating across a week. And so, you know, just the impact of that, extending further. I think one of the things that is important to remember is what you were saying, Joy, is that these numbers and these figures were from pre-COVID. And so we know that kids had already had a tenuous relationship with school before the additional issues that they're having to navigate now. And for me, that is very important because it speaks to exactly where their level of disengagement is at. it is a lot harder to now motivate a learner who feels like there's no way they're going to make it, even if they do come back. So reintegrating learners back into a space when they've already felt so completely unable to do it before they had to deal with COVID and before they had to navigate the issues that they are navigating now as a result of COVID is a lot more strenuous for practitioners on the ground and for teachers. Secondly, we're also going to see a lot more repetition, and that's going to mean that there's going to be a lot more heterogeneity in our classrooms, requiring a lot more differentiated teaching from our teachers in spaces that are already overcrowded and under-resourced. And so I think that's also an additional strain, and to think about, you know, kind of what kind of interaction or the quality of that interaction or that facilitation of learning in that space, what that will look like in later years. And I'm sure, you know, it won't be ideal. And so, again, the issue around kind of wraparound support and catching learners up and providing the space that they're going to need to, to find a value in school again. And to encourage them to return to school again is going to be harder. I know we spoke about the impact for primary school learners, but I think for high school learners, we're going to see a lot more dropout just because they have had a longer 10 years experience with the system, meaning that their disengagement, you know, is a lot likely to be a lot higher than our younger learners. And we also know that from previous years, even before COVID, that our dropout rate is a lot higher around our grade 10 grade. And so, you know, seeing those kinds of exits from the system, I think will continue and potentially higher than we've seen before. The last thing I want to say, which has been quite shocking for me, is in trying to track and trace these learners that haven't returned back to school, one of the things that has really become clear that COVID has blown wide open is that we're not prepared for that. And so we haven't ever done it before. And so one of the things we found is that many schools don't have contact numbers for families or children. We don't have addresses stored. And so we've actually depended really on the NGOs and programs that have been working with kids outside of the school space and have you know, that kind of details and connection to their communities and families to go and find learners, particularly where migration has happened because of job losses, for example, which COVID has definitely impacted. And so I think those kinds of barriers are going to decrease our ability to respond very well. And we're needing to think about how we put in preventative measures, you know, to help us to not repeat that again. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Merle. And thanks, Nic. I guess I just want to shift into understanding how is it that Ecamp Youth managed to keep your learners engaged during lockdown last year? I mean, your matric results were, you know, better than the year before, I think. And how was that possible? How did you do that?
Yeah, thanks, Joy. But maybe before I address that question, I just wanted to emphasize one or two points from the previous contributions. I think education is meant, or a good education is meant to be one of the equalizers around addressing inequality in society. And unfortunately, with these learning losses, we are just going to find a lot more entrenchment of inequality and a lot more learners from disadvantaged communities actually accessing the mainstream economy at the end of the day. I think as Merle was articulating, dropout and repetition, we expect to see quite an increase on that front. We're already seeing it in terms of the rotational timetables and the impact that they have in terms of curriculum coverage. And one other point, there was an article over the weekend which was talking about how teachers are stretched at the moment in terms of trying to push the curriculum. And from that perspective, we actually see when learners come through to our program that there's an increased need for that remedial tutoring so that we can crystallize concepts learned in class so that we kind of mitigate the learning gaps. And then, of course, that report even went further to say learners are actually being treated almost like robots at the moment because there's this huge push just to cover the curriculum. But in terms of the actual learning, and concepts being grasped, there seems to be a deficit there. Then coming to the question you addressed to me, last year was quite an interesting year for Ikamva Youth. Our program has always been predicated on in-person tutoring. And we've got this very almost rigid model where it's one tutor in terms of ratio, one tutor, 5 learners, and they kind of all huddle around the table. And we're trying to zero in into the specific challenges that a learner particularly has. With COVID and the school shutdowns, our program almost came to a halt, but we managed to innovate quite quickly and shift the entire model online. One of the advantages that we had in terms of how that shift managed to actually work as well as it did was that some of the main components of our program is to ensure that learners have the ability to self-study and learn. We encourage our learners to take ownership of their learning and teach them the skills they need to self-study. This became critical at a point where learners had no access to teachers, no access to school, but that ethos was already ingrained in them. And when we availed the online resources and the online tutoring, it was a logical move for them in terms of continuing with their education. But one of the issues we realized, Joy, on this one is that tech innovations alone are really not the panacea to some of the education challenges, especially those occasioned by COVID, because most of the learners come from disadvantaged backgrounds and don't have the means to access those tech innovations. Significant investments from our side had to be made to try and level the playing field with peers in higher quintile schools in terms of giving them the data, purchasing devices just to make sure that there could be meaningful engagement. We had to come up with a completely new M&E tool to ensure that we're tracking participation and engagement. And I think the proximity of our tutors, our branch staff to the learners actually helped keep them engaged. We had scenarios where tutors or branch staff would actually go to a learner's house and say, why aren't you engaged? There is an intervention that will actually help you throughout the year, and ultimately get the parents involved, get the learner involved to make sure that they are engaged. And I think ultimately we bore the fruits of such kind of interventions last year.
Great, thanks so much. Okay, it's good to see that there's some interesting questions coming through. Siklalile's question around, the question is, does the DBE have a plan to address the gaps in foundation phase, which will show the ability for learners to grasp more complex concepts in later years? Nic and Merle, I know you guys are both working with Reading for Meaning programs and then also have links to research that's happening. So do either of you have insights into Siklalile's question?
Joy, I mean, the short answer is no, they don't.
Yeah, it's really disturbing, and I think that that we really need to take inspiration from the programs that have sprung up and have been doing this work for decades, because sitting around and waiting for policies and funding to implement those policies, it's clear that there was a crisis before, and yeah, the prospect of things getting worse is actually just too awful to fathom.
I mean, Joy, maybe a more constructive, positively framed or response would also be that I think as a sector, what we need to be doing is to say, let's not propose solutions that the DBE is unlikely to take up politically or financially. And the one example I said is we need to start thinking strategically about what are the politically palatable, financially palatable solutions that also tick the goal of trying to do catch up or prepare kids. For example, the revealed preferences of the ANC is jobs, not education, not ECD, not any of these other things that we think are important. And I'm sure the ANC says that's important, but their current revealed preferences is that there's 100 billion rand for jobs. Now, if we say, okay, the youth basic employment education thing that's hiring youth and paying them about 3,000 Rand a month, if there were proposals saying, how could those youths be productively used in the after school space? That's a sort of proposal that the government could actually take action on, rather than lamenting and gnashing our teeth and getting all upset about like, why isn't the government doing more? We should be doing more. We should be doing more. That falls on deaf ears. And I think it's also just politically naive. So I think if we can see where the wind is blowing and then try and set our sails according to that wind, we're much more likely to get things that are both in the best interests of kids and also are politically possible.
Yeah, thanks. I totally agree. Merle, I know you, a lot of the implementing partners that you work with are thinking in that way. Do you want to maybe share some of those insights?
Yeah, indeed. I think we found it incredibly valuable to position ourselves as critical partners in terms of what DB is doing. So critically, responding to what's happening, but also partnering in terms of trying to create active knowledge and trying to find ways to do it in a better way. And so some of our partners actually partnered with, one of our programs partnered with the Youth Employment Initiative the past 3 months to implement a TAL strategy, which looks at teaching at the right level to teach some literacy, foundational literacy for learners. Now, the time frame was too short. We all know that. It was done at a particularly difficult time when schools were actually closed. So, all of those kinds of real logistical challenges were an issue. But I think the important thing was that there was an opportunity for us to really present the potential of working together in such a way. So using an after school program, for example, that has existing results, really kind of grounded relationships in communities and schools, and can produce the kind of outcomes that these programs is hoping to accomplish. And funneling in the support in terms of the funding or the human resources or whatever it is in that kind of a way, and partnering in that kind of way to reach mutually beneficial outcomes. I think that's important. And I think if we can strengthen that kind of engagement where we are trying to position ourselves in ways, where we can capitalize on ideas. It's hard, and it requires a lot of persistence and constant engagement. And often it doesn't work out the way in which we envision it, because obviously there's a lot of different interests to balance. And I think that because our education space can often be politically challenging, that does make it even harder. But I think that what is important is that if we can surface, as this report has done, so continually how these interventions work and the results around how they work, and make sure that we can make the links around where the partnerships can exist, I think we have a better chance of getting them institutionalized in some way. Again, this is not something that's a kind of thing that you can do really quickly, but I think that there is appetite at the moment for that kind of discussion. And so that seems to be a little bit encouraging for me. Yeah.
Thanks, Merle. There's some questions in the Q&A also pertaining to, the issue that we started with, which is where does the money come from? And I'd really like to just put Sibongile on the spot here in terms of in answering Rafaro's question, where she's asking about how this, what would the recommendations be to how the sector uses this report, and your thoughts just around getting the necessary investments to shift the needle for the sector.
Thanks, Joy. So Rafaro, currently the money comes from foundations and trusts, so philanthropy, particularly the money that's channeled through us. And we conduit grants to after school programs, but that's not nearly enough. And I hear Nic on his point about not being politically naive. So I think it possibly would be naive to think that government should fund the after school programs, right? But what isn't naive is to think maybe there should be other sources of funding, bigger funds that we haven't been able to access. And that's the point of this investment case, right? So where else can we leverage funding that we haven't before? Maybe development funding, maybe structuring some innovative finance models like social impact bonds or development impact bonds, really finding sustainable sources of funding and big sources of funding, not only only, individual philanthropy or organizations funding the Learning Trust and after-school programs directly, but really big, large amounts of money that can help us proliferate after-school in areas that they don't even exist in. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Sibongile. Lungile, I see your hand is up. Would you like to ask a question? Okay,
sorry about that, Lungile. I've just allowed her to speak.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I.
Okay. No, I was just saying about the effects of kids not going to school. We run an after-school program in the east of Johannesburg, and about 80% of the kids go once a week to school, and the living condition are not good, and the parents, they're not working. So before even COVID-19, there was a lot of uncles just idling on the streets. It's a culture, drinking, smoking. Now it's worse, and the kids now are picking up on this behavior because they just don't have anything to do. One house is gonna have 4 families. So, which is supposed to be a lounge for the family, it's a room for a mother and a father and the children, and another bedroom. So, and now we just, because our organization can cater for a big number. So what we've been doing is going to other organizations who are not doing anything with the kids and just say, maybe can we run our programs here so that there's safer spaces for kids to learn and grow. So it's a big challenge, and I don't know how they will just match up or catch up to the middle class people who goes every day to school. There's no internet, let alone a computer to access. So the digital divide has just gone even more. So there's like a big.
Sorry, Lungile, I think we lost you, but thanks for sharing that important point. Nic, do you want to respond?
I think the point about which is both a point that Sibongile made, but also that others have made about funding. Like, where does this come from? Where does the money come from about the things that we're trying to get money for? And I think it's the nub of the issue here. In the report that you wrote and that you guys have released, it's to say there are a number of very promising programs that have been evaluated and seem to show a lot of promise. I also see Lynn Bowie's comment about Oloko in the chat, where she was saying, we are trying to do this on a small scale, but the big question is, how do we get those promising initiatives to scale up? And there's some technical challenges with that. If we said, okay, Oloko service 5,000 more kids, what would that look like? Even if the funding was there, they would have technical challenges, everyone would. But there's a bigger question of where the money comes from. And I think that this is maybe the big conceptual shift that's needed in both the after-school space as well as the ECD space, which is to stop asking for the crumbs off the table. If this is an important enough sector and you've got strong enough evidence, stop being polite. And I heard earlier this thing about saying, oh, it's primarily driven by philanthropic money. In education, basic education, higher education, philanthropy makes up less than 2% of the total amount of money that gets spent on education. 98% of the money that gets spent on basic education and higher education is spent by government. In ECD, it's even more, right? Because of how small government spending is in ECD. So I'm not that the percentage is more or smaller. It's that the scope for even a small change in government spending in ECD is huge. And I think the same thing in the after-school space. If government even notionally kind of looked in the direction of the after-school space, it could make a massive difference. And I think that coordination and what we've seen with collective bargaining and the power of the unions in the basic education space, I wonder if we don't need a similar thing in the ECD space and in the after-school space, where there needs to be a collective voice. There can't be this chattering by every single NGO and their granny saying, take us seriously. We've written a policy note. We've written a policy note. You almost need a after sector bargaining council type of thing to negotiate and to have these conversations and make demands that are very reasonable, but you have the broad backing of 45, 50 of the biggest NGOs that are working in that space. And I think at the moment, everyone is sort of independently going to their particular representative in the Western Cape or in Limpopo or in National or whatever it might be. And that's never going to be a productive strategy. Maybe summarized as stop asking for the crumbs.
Thanks, Nic. I think that's such an important point. Andrew, I think you're on the call. It would be great if you could respond to Nic's point just around, what is the capacity for scale? For example, could Olico suddenly massively expand its reach if we were to find the funds?
Hi, everyone. Yeah, for sure. So Andrew from Olico Maths Education. We provide after-school math support to learners. I think there's a couple of things to note. I mean, a lot of the talk around catch-up and remediation is really the field of expertise for lots of after-school programs, because it is what is done. It's not necessarily always in the way of remediation in terms of going back by grades, but when you're sitting with a learner, you often are moving backwards and covering content that would have been needed for them to be able to engage with whatever topic they're working on. So there is a sense that even in these COVID times, actually after-school programs have lots of experience with this. And it's worth looking at what's often defined overseas as accelerated learning, as opposed to sort of pure remediation, and something for us to really build on in this sector. But I think there's a very provocative case to be put down, as Nic is saying, to stop asking for crumbs. I mean, if we look at what's happening in the Western Cape in terms of their matric outputs in mathematics, they're literally in quintile 1 to 4 schools. On average, there's only 4 kids in each school that are getting out of matric with a 50% or more pass. I mean, that on the one hand is obviously extremely shocking, but it is clearly a massive opportunity. And so I want to pick up the provocative case or the provocative position that we need to always start right at the bottom. We can actually intervene at the beginning of high school, and Economist even showing that even in the last few years of high school, and we can get some really good results out of that. I mean, when we were pricing something, what that means is in the quintile 1 to 4 schools in the Western Cape, in total, they matriculate about 700 kids with maths passes above 50% every year. That's out of all of the quintile 1 to 4 schools in the Western Cape. So clearly there's an opportunity for us to double that. And I mean, just back of the envelope calculations for us is you can probably put down 10 to 15 million Rand a year for the first couple of years, upping that to about a sustainable amount of 30 million a year. And you can double bachelor level pass rates from quintile 1 to 4 schools. So I think that message has got to go out there alongside the very strong advocacy that Nic's calling for as well. Like saying, we're not here to sort of play around. We actually can make a massive, substantial difference here. And this is the opportunity that presents for us.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Andrew. Thanks, everyone, for all of these questions. I think we're going to have to carry the conversation through the social media channels because we have just 5 minutes left. So I guess just in closing, I wanted to ask each of the people on the panel to kind of share some closing thoughts and then to end off with Sibongile. So yeah, from my side, I just want to thank you all. I totally agree, Nic. I think it's time to stop asking for crumbs. I think we have enough evidence. I think we have a lot of capacity, and I think we need to start shouting about that. So thanks for the nudge. All right, so let's just go in the order that you introduced yourself. So Nic, closing thoughts from you, please.
Sure, I'll be very quick and to summarize the same thing. I think if you've got the evidence, and that is a really important if you've got the evidence that shows that what you're doing is effective, back yourself strongly and collectively, and stop asking for the crumbs.
I will say, I think that today is a really good start to doing that, because I think this is a very useful report to kind of position kind of what's happening in the after school space, the real opportunity that exists to make a difference, and come around and crowd in support into schools in a real way. And so I think if we could do more of this, really surfacing the evidence, making sure that we're putting it out into the right spaces in the right way, and making sure that we are tagging onto what the strategic outputs or strategic targets are for DBE, I think that would be very beneficial to all of us. And then, of course, thanks very much to the Learning Trust for allowing us to participate. Thank you.
Yeah, and for me, Joy, my message is very short as well. I think it's about time that the spotlight is shone on this sector. And I think one of the challenges definitely, as highlighted by Nic, is the issue of collective impact that the sector needs to be able to demonstrate as a unit that this is the kind of impact, and you can then lobby and advocate from a very strong base. I think the evidence is there, but it's fragmented at the moment. And I think I would really want to call a lot more researchers like Nic and everyone else out there to work with the sector in terms of connecting the dots that will actually build an even stronger case for the sector. And just in terms of some of the questions, I saw a couple of questions around, I just wanted to make this point. The issue around needs, I think, is an absolute important issue that we are currently seized with. And the after-school sector is definitely well positioned to be addressing this from a proactive perspective rather than in a reactionary way, which seems to be what's happening with government. So I think there is a case to be made, but once again, once that collective impact is demonstrated. And just to thank you, Joy, for working on this paper, and Spongile for putting this in the spotlight. We look forward to more conversations and contributing the best we can around the challenges we're faced with. Thank you.
Right, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Nic, Merle, and Hope, and a big thank you to you, Joy. This report wouldn't have been launched in this way without you, and thank you so much for taking such an interest in the after-school space and not leaving us completely. So we're looking to you and many other researchers to do further research on this to really unearth the impact of after-school programs. One thing that I wanted to say is to emphasize your point, Merle, about crowding in support into schools. And that's exactly what after-school programs are about. It's not a parallel system that's happening in addition to an outside of schooling. After-school programs are about supporting schooling and learners. And so I think it's an extension of the school system. I see the question that you asked, Ralph, has been responded to by Nic, but I did want to make the point also about spending not being the silver bullet, but in after school especially, it's likely to be a better spend than to see how we can, expect the DBE and government to fund these learning outcomes. And thank you so much for also coming in, Andrew, and illustrating the point of the kinds of results that we can see from after school. So with that, thank you everybody for joining us. We're going to collect some of these questions and see if we can answer on the side as well. This recording is available if you want to share it with your colleagues. We're going to send a follow-up email with that, and also look out for us in the media in the coming days. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.